And how are you doing with this? Is your family all doing fine?
Yes, very well. Uh, every day it's a new battle, right?
Yeah, that's right.
Yes, it's basically this. And now I have this studio here in Rio,
Okay.
which is it's a good place for me to make my own things. I have my
Hmm.
piano. You see the drums over here.
Yeah,
Is proof sound, so it's not a problem with neighbors, and
sure.
you know
Yeah,
the drill, right?
yeah, yeah.
But just to make sure, do you have I I am recording this interview. Is that all right for you?
Yeah, that's fine. Sure.
Is everything? Do you have anything to agree on your screen to?
No, I don't. But if you have record on, I think that should be fine. I think
Uh,
since you're
oh,
the host, I think you're the one that determines whether you can record or not. So
so that's great.
yeah,
So,
it's
Bill,
fine with me. Yeah. Okay.
the first thing I would like to ask you, um, uh, I was preparing for this interview, and I two two videos came across my path. The
Hmm.
first one is the sonata for sax and piano,
Uh-huh.
tenor saxophone and piano, and a
Yeah.
concerto for orchestra.
Or
That was
concerto for
or
jazz orchestra. Yeah.
yeah, double DR, the German,
Yeah.
right?
Yep.
So, Bill, how do you deal with this the restraint of classical forms in a way, and the freedom that inherent to jazz?
Uh, well, I don't really feel like thinking within a particular formal design really has any restraints or limitations. In fact, I think it's actually a help because it gives you an overall idea of how you want to organize your material. It doesn't necessarily make any limitations on the content or how you develop it, or even the melodic or harmonic or rhythmic language that you want to work with. It just gives you a general idea for an overall design before you begin. But while you're composing, you can modify that design and personalize it in any way you want while you're continuing to write. I think certainly the greatest jazz composer so far has been Duke Ellington, and Duke Ellington utilized a wide variety of forms in his composing and arranging, but they were all they were all variations in the early years, like up until around 1945 or so. Um, there were variations of basic forms that you see in classical music, like various kinds of binary and ternary forms, uh, and sometimes he related those forms to harmonic progressions or harmonic forms that are related to the blues in one way or another. Um, the the form of a lot of ragtime music, piano music, of course, that used the formal design of the military march, or you also find a similar design in classical music in the uh, scherzo and trio movements of the symphonies, where you have an ABA kind of form, and then um, the transition, and then something else. So yeah, those were. I can tell you a little bit about how I thought about both of those pieces. I mean, the sonata for soprano, saxophone, and piano, that was really using sonata form in the first movement, although there's an introduction, just like there are many first movements to sonatas have introductions before the first thematic section begins. And then the, um, the formal design of the second movement was similar to formal designs that you hear in slow movements of sonatas or symphonies, and basically had two contrasting uh, thematic sections with their own motivic ideas and contrasting kinds of harmonic colors and progressions. And then the third movement was a variation on the basic rondo form, where you have this A section that acts like a ritornello that keeps coming back, and in between the returns of that theme, then you have a secondary idea and then a third idea. And the main thing that I tried to do in the sonata was use a harmonic vocabulary that used elements from the impressionistic composers that I really enjoy, like especially Debussy, Ravel, Scriabin, also even some of the Spanish impressionists like Mampo and Albanese, and but also to allow that to be um, allow that to mix in a free way and a natural way with harmonic vocabulary that I've gotten from jazz composers, although they were also influenced by the classical composers. I'm talking especially about uh, let's see about well, Ellington and Strayhorn, of course, and Claire Fisher, who's probably my favorite composer, as you know. And yeah, so that's what that's how the sonata for saxophone and piano came about. And later on, I did. I don't know if you can find a recording of this online, but I orchestrated the sonata for a project that I did with Dave Liebman with the Metropole Orchestra in Holland. And the uh, the orchestrated version of the sonata is just called Triptych, or three part piece, and it's basically the same musical content, but it's also I guess like a kind of concerto for soprano saxophone and studio orchestra. But the musical content is really the same as in the sonata, but just orchestrated for the instrumentation that the Metropole Orchestra was using.
I see.
Now
Yeah.
with the concerto for jazz orchestra, um, I I was inspired to use a five movement form for that because of the Concerto for Orchestra of Bela Bartok, which also uses a five movement design. Um, but there were other influences as well. The first and first, well, the five movements, they're in key centers that are in major third, minor third. So the first and last movements are the C is the tonic, but it's not so much major or minor or blues. It's sort of a combination, and there are places where I also use what I would call a polytonal kind of design. Where we have motivic ideas or counterpoint that's happening in more than in two or more key centers at the same time. Uh, that was something also that Bartok did in classical music, but an important jazz composer that was using that idea a lot also was George Russell. But George Russell's term, he's the one that wrote the book called The Lydian Concept of the Lydian Chromatic Concept of Tonal Organization. And when in his music he uses a slightly different term that he invented. Instead of calling it polytonal, he called it pantonal. And his main idea of a lot of the music that he wrote was to be able to use the kind of pantonal or polytonal colors that Bartok used, but in jazz. And just as with Bartok, even though you have polytonality, most of the time the melodic material that's being used polytonally is from conventional sources like Hungarian folk songs. So George Russell did a similar thing and used in his music sometimes melodic motifs that came from African American folk songs or children's songs, and also the blues. So you have two or three lines that are in different keys, but each one may be a kind of blues melody in that key. Um, so I used some of those concepts in the concerto, but then I also used a lot of things that I've learned from all my favorite composers, including also Bill Holman and Brookmeyer, and the five movements then were in C, and then the second movement, which was a waltz, was in E flat, and the middle movement was the ballad that was in G flat or F sharp, and the fourth movement was like a scherzo, but really more like a kind of toccata. So I used 12/8 meter with a Latin kind of influence as well, and in a rondo kind of theme, kind of rondo kind of form with a basic ritornello that comes back with different contrasting things in between each recurrence of that. And then one thing that I found, there was a piece that I studied quite a bit. I think you probably know. I think you might even have a score from when you were at Eastman, the Bill Holman piece, Jazz in D minor, that was written for the Australian Jazz Quintet. And one of the things that I found interesting in that piece, it was just a three movement piece, but in the first and last movements, which were fast tempo, um, each of those movements had the same long introduction that was more than 50 measures. And in that long introduction, he introduces all the thematic material that he's going to use in the whole piece. So I did something similar in my concerto for jazz orchestra, but instead of starting out with the fast tempo, which we ultimately get to in both the first and the last movements, I started with an introduction that's kind of a majestic kind of feeling. And that also, it introduces all of the main thematic material that's going to be used in all five movements. I actually based the melodic content on a 12-tone row, but instead of using it in the strict sense of having to use every note before you can repeat one, I used it in a freer way where you could use groups of consecutive notes and kind of work your way forward through the row, but also using repetitions and changing octaves whenever it fit the kinds of melodies that you wanted to make. So it was a good way of keeping that, what can be a very inconvenient system of trying to write, using a 12-tone row, but that frees it up so that it just becomes a general way of making sure that everything is related motivically, but still allowing yourself to develop motivic material the way you hear it, just within those basic confines. So the first and fifth movement start with this really majestic kind of introduction, but then each one develops that material into completely different fast tempo stuff with the material. In the last movement, just like in Holman's Jazz in D minor, because I had a long introduction, the final movement also has a very long coda to kind of balance everything. And as far as the other characters, the movement in E flat is kind of lyrical, kind of romantic, but it also has a blues element. And the first theme sounds very bluesy, and I can't. I think it's 16 bars instead of 12 bars. But once you hear the main theme, then the second time through, there's a counter line, no harmonies yet, but just a secondary line that makes a nice counterpoint to the first line. And the main melodic line in the second movement actually is introduced by the bass trombone in the low register. And then later on in the movement, this bass line comes back as the melodic line of later sections, and it's harmonized in different ways. The ballad movement, it used introductory material in between to set up the movement, and then it also used a variation of that material between the exposition of the main theme and there's a bass solo, and then also used it again before the recapitulation of part of the ballad theme, and then a final variation with some extensions in the coda. And then the fourth movement, where I used rondo form, was in A minor actually, and kind of bluesy. And another thing I did with instrumentation, I wrote this concerto so that the first, third, and fifth movements, they use only brass and saxophones, no woodwind doubles. So if a big band doesn't have a lot of woodwind doubles, they can play just the first, third, and fifth movements and they work actually as a shorter concerto for jazz orchestra, which is 3 movements. The second movement uses only clarinet choir, and the baritone player in the band at the WDR, he also liked to play the little E flat piccolo clarinet. So there are some sections where the clarinet choir is the main texture and melodic material, and in those sections I have the E flat clarinet on top. So you have the E flat piccolo, 2 or 3 B flat clarinets, and then 1 or 2 bass clarinets. Um, and then the 12/8 movement, um, I used only flutes, alto flutes, and piccolo. And what happens in that the rondo movement is that the thematic material, the A section material, it's first introduced by the trombone section, and then there's a contrasting theme, and then it's introduced uh, by the flugelhorns in place of trumpets. I used flugelhorns so that they wouldn't overpower the flutes when I wanted to use those. And then the C theme comes after that, and then when the main theme comes back the third time, it's only the flutes. Um, and I think in that first section with the flutes, I just used the 2 alto flutes and 3 regular flutes. But then in the final A section at the very end of the movement, where the whole band is playing it, um, the trombones and flugelhorns now change to trumpets, and the woodwinds are all playing the same thematic material with the same basic harmonization. But in the last part, where the trumpets are playing trumpets, then I have the piccolo in the lead for the woodwinds. So I have piccolo and 4 flutes instead of the 3 flutes and 2 alto flutes from before. So anyway, that before I wrote any of the movements, I actually figured out, that basic design of having the brass and saxes for movements 1, 3, and 5, and clarinets only with the brass for the second movement, only flutes for the fourth. The meters and the kind of overall flavor that I thought was going to happen, and then the actual composition was uh, um, getting some thematic motifs for each section, and then developing those within the kind of mood that I wanted to create.
Wow. You kind of answer everything I was planning to ask you, which is really good because now I can get into more details.
Yeah, well, the thing, those are anybody that wants to listen to that. I think you can find that on the internet. There's um,
On
uh,
YouTube.
yeah, the Concerto for Jazz Orchestra. Do you
Yes.
do you know do you know that website?
Yes.
Or
You just
okay.
go to
So,
the WDR channel, and your concert is there.
oh, but another thing is there's a website. I can give it to you. I might not be able to find it right now, but I can email it to you, and
All
then you
right.
can you can you can email it to any people there that want to check it out. There's an organization called uh, um, oh International International Society for Arrangers and yeah International Society for American Composers and Arrangers, um, something like that. Uh, they I don't know if this is every month, but they have composers that are in the organization or composers whose music they're interested in. They invite people on a regular basis to provide a recording of one of their pieces, and then to do a, a kind of essay, or it could be like an analysis of the composition. And then they have a site where you can go and you can both link on the recording and also see and download the analysis and essay. So I did one of those for the Concerto for Jazz Orchestra,
Oh, that's good.
and there's about three, at least 3 or so um, condensed C score excerpts for each of the 5 movements, and there's quite extensive analysis and some introductory comments on my process, and so I think that might be interesting for people to check out after they listen to the piece. Then you can check out the essay and see the technical things, and maybe listen to it again after that.
Oh, thank you so much. I will, if you can give that to me, I will insert later
Yeah,
on
yeah,
the.
I'll find it after our interview, and right away afterwards. It'll probably take 5 minutes or so, and then I'll send you the link. Okay.
Thank you. And so coming back just a little bit, uh, it seems that every great composer in the history of music give some sort of hints of what's about to come after him or her. Um, you can think of that in both classical and jazz music.
hmm
So, having said that, uh, what can you say about Duke Ellington and Strayhorn partnership, and concerning this approach that they have with harmony, rhythms, everything that they brought to their music that did not belong to their time because they were so advanced, I think, right? Yes.
Well, that the thing that they the thing that they brought to it that was different really had to do with jazz more than the harmonies, because um, Duke Ellington and Strayhorn both listened to classical music, so they were influenced by that for sure. The thing that's most personal about both of them is their melody writing, and that's not so much a unique thing, but it's a thing that you can find in classical composers as well, like in their in their ballads, in their slow pieces. They both were fond of using wide melodic leaps. So uh, uh, if you think of I'm going to turn my keyboard on here. If you think of the B section of Sophisticated Lady, you hear those wide leaps. They always get resolved melodically, like this gets resolved. This one too, and then this does too. But they like the dramatic effect of that. Um, but as far as harmonic things, I think the thing about all really creative composers is that they always keep their ears open to finding things that attract them in any of the music that's surrounding them in their society and in their um, social environment. So they certainly heard all the great music from Bach to the Romantic composers and the Impressionists, just as much as they heard music from the American Songbook and Black American music like blues and rhythm and blues and the jazz of that period. Um, so one interesting thing, I don't know if you realize this, but I don't have the music with me right now. But if you there's a piece by Ravel, actually a collection of pieces by Ravel called Valse Noble et Sentimentale, and I think the second one of those, the second or third piece, um, the opening has the exact kinds of harmonic colors that Strayhorn used in Chelsea Bridge,
Mm.
and that it was not an accident because Strayhorn was really checking out that music. So that's a really good example for people that are listening to this. If you go and get that collection of pieces by Ravel for piano, it's pretty obvious. Let me just see if I'm going to just. It's just 10 seconds away. I'm going to see if I can
That's all right.
grab it really quick. I'll be right back.
Yeah, all right.
Yeah, I couldn't find it, but anyway, it's just the idea of these augmented triads and even the connection with the half step. It's yeah,
Yeah,
it's not exactly the same melody, but it's those colors at the beginning, and it's a good example of how Ravel used those colors one way in that piece from the waltzes, and Strayhorn took exactly the same colors and harmonic relationships and developed it into a different kind of piece.
I remember during class when you said about Ellington's voicings,
Yeah,
which were so modern, like, and you mentioned Stravinsky.
yeah.
Uh, so, and since that period, I start to listen with this, trying to make these connections, and it's so impressive
Hmm.
how they and it sounds so tonal, so simple, don't you think?
Yeah. Well, uh,
I
the
mean,
important
it's
thing
so well
is,
done. That's what I mean. It's so well
yeah,
done
yeah.
that
The important thing is that it's really the same with the classical composers. The best ones they never use tension or dissonance just to be dissonant.
yes, yeah,
It's always used because they want you to pay attention, and then if you're paying attention, you can hear the resolution of the dissonances where it goes. So that's the main thing, and it's the same with Claire Fischer's music too. You know, he had some of the same influences as Ellington and Strayhorn, and well, in fact, they were one of his influences in addition to the classical composers, but also the early music. Well, not just the early music, but yeah, the harmonic language in the symphonies and string quartets of Shostakovich is something also that Claire Fischer used a lot in his music. That it's even like a little step further than what Ellington and Strayhorn were doing, but it still includes all of that. And maybe one important principle that I could bring up now that's really helped me in my development is that the I'm trying to think of how I usually talk about it, how I um, express it in words. Uh, oh yeah, it's something that's actually is very relevant to topics from the whole universe to composing and improvising music, and that's the general concept of uh, include and transcend, because everything that's happened in the process of evolution, not only on this planet but in the universe, it started in one way and then gradually developed to another level, which was never a complete departure from what happened before, but it took what was going on before and added to it. So the same thing has happened in the evolution of music that's related to the European harmonic language. It started in Europe around the time of Bach and around the end of the 16th century, and then it continued to evolve through the Romantic composers and the early 20th century composers, and then in American music, the music of the so-called American songbook, uh, with composers like Irving Berlin and George Gershwin and Jerome Kern, and of course Ellington and Strayhorn also contributed songs to the American songbook. But that took the harmonic language of European music and added elements from the blues and from I guess that was the main thing at the time. It added elements from the blues and from American, both white American and black American folk music. And then as that continued to get slightly more abstract or more dissonant, like in European music, Shostakovich, he was still using conventional forms in the symphonies and string quartets, but and he used a lot of colorful harmonies that some of which you might even associate with the Impressionists. but he also incorporated still a slightly higher degree of dissonance, but always a dissonance that's meant to resolve. So you can hear when tension is created. You can also hear, if you follow the music, where the resolution comes. And again, it was the process of transcend and include. So Shostakovich's music, it included everything from the time of Bach. In fact, Bach was one of his big influences, but it continued to add without without losing anything from the original source, to just expand, continue to expand the vocabulary, so you have a few more possibilities.
For sure. And it's incredible how within the boundaries of each time of history of period
Yeah.
they achieve a universal truth, right? Everything is there. uh, if you see Bach or Mozart, even in the 20th century, the ragtime folks in Brazilian music, the same. With the
Yeah.
amount of knowledge they had, they
Yeah.
achieve great things, right?
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
That's
inside.
where that's where the comparison of music language to verbal language comes in, because we're using verbal language now, and people the people who can most clearly express their ideas are the people that can use the words in the language that exists in order to express things.
Yeah,
And sometimes not just very basic things, but sometimes things that are very connected to philosophic or spiritual ideas or states of mind. Um, so if your vocabulary is very limited, it it's going to confine you in terms of how much you can express with the verbal language, and the same thing is true of music, right?
yes, that's true. Yeah. So, Bill, another thing I would like to ask you. Oh, I can't see you.
Oh, there, okay.
No, now it's good. It's good. Um, you have done something that I think is fantastic. The recordings of jazz piano history.
Oh, yeah.
What can you tell me about that project of yours?
Well, it goes back to, I could say a little bit. One of the things that's been interesting for me is how almost seemingly accidentally, or at least um, serendipitously, things can happen in life. You meet somebody, and then because of them, you meet somebody else, and that leads to different opportunities. We all experience things like this. So, one in 1983, the Eastman Studio Orchestra, which Ray Wright was conducting at the time, he had started the jazz program at Eastman. They performed at the International Association of Jazz Educators conference in Columbus, Ohio, and when I was there at the convention, there was a friend of mine from Vienna, Austria, a trombonist and a composer and arranger named Heinz Chaddick, and he introduced me to some friends of his from southern Germany, Hans and Veronica Gruber. And at the time, they were starting this jazz publishing company called Advanced Music. So I got to know them and started doing workshops in Germany from time to time with them, and contributed some books and some transcriptions and things to their publications that they did. And earlier in my life, in the in the late 70s, I wrote a series of teaching books in a way on jazz piano called The Contemporary Jazz Pianist. And the first two were more about playing piano in a group where you're playing with a rhythm section, but it also went into a lot of useful ideas about musical vocabulary and different ways of developing material and improvisations when you're playing a solo. The third and fourth volumes were more specifically about solo piano playing without rhythm section, just solo piano. And in volume three, I just wrote a lot of original pieces that demonstrated a lot of basic jazz piano styles, from ragtime and boogie woogie and gospel up through contemporary things. And then I got this idea to I was inspired by one of my favorite jazz pianists. His name is Dick Hyman, and one of the things that's amazing about Dick Hyman is that he can play all of the old jazz styles like stride and ragtime, and with just amazing technique. But he also plays in modern styles too, and uses vocabulary that you associate with Bud Powell or Bill Evans or anything more contemporary. And I think it was shortly after we moved to Rochester when I first started teaching at Eastman around 1973 or so, sometime in the mid 70s. He came out with a little book of short jazz piano pieces, and there was a little plastic record that you could put on that so you could hear him playing them, and they were um, let's see. I think these were just not based on a common theme, but they were just little pieces in the styles of these different pianists. And then I noticed that he came out with the solo LP with a similar idea. In those piano pieces, it started with ragtime and then ended up with something more or less in the Bill Evans style or something like that. And this recording that he did, I think it came out around 78 or so, was called Variations on a Child is Born. So he took this song of Thad Jones, A Child is Born. I'm not going to play through the whole thing, but many people maybe have heard that. So he wrote, I think maybe, or he played and improvised on about 9 or 10 different variations, starting with a Scott Joplin style, and then a couple of stride pieces like James P. Johnson and maybe Art Tatum, and he even had one that was in the style of Cecil Taylor. And that record made a big impression on me. So when I was doing the last volume, thinking about the fourth and final volume for this series of books, I got the idea to do something similar to what Dick Hyman had done, but pick a different theme. So I wanted to pick something from the American Songbook and something that had at least one part in both a major and a minor key, so that you could get the two different kinds of 2/5. So the ones with the minor seven and with the minor seven and basic dominant chords, and then the ones with the half diminished and dominant altered chords. So I ended up choosing All of Me, uh, that one, and so I just wrote an original tune based on those chords. So in my melody, I sort of made an inversion of the original melody. So instead of doing this, I did this. And then I thought, well, this was a little influenced by of course, Bach, because he's always been one of my favorites. And of course, with Bach, you have the well-tempered clavier, where he has not just one set, but two sets of 24 preludes and fugues that are in all 12 major and minor keys. So I thought, well, it'd be interesting to do variations on this theme, and maybe use 12 pianists was not really enough. So I had got the idea of doing 12 variations in the styles of earlier or traditional pianists, starting with ragtime and ending with the boogie woogie players, and then doing 12 in more modern styles, starting with Thelonious Monk and Bud Powell. And I did include Cecil Taylor as well, and the one that I ended with, although there's been more development since then, of course, but a pianist from just about the same generation as me, whose music I've always liked a lot, is Richie Byrack. So the 12th, the modern variations was a tribute to Richie. And then once I decided on the pianist, that was the difficult part. So I used as a as a way of limiting the number. I only used solo pianists who had made a number of solo piano recordings that were influential. So that's one of the reasons why, for example, McCoy Tyner and Herbie Hancock were not in there, but her, uh, Chick Corea and Keith Jarrett were, because Chick Corea and Keith Jarrett had done some really influential solo records for ECM in the 70s. And at that time, Herbie and McCoy hadn't yet done any solo piano recordings, although they did a long time after this book came out. So yeah, so first I wrote the whole thing out as music, and what helped me with that really is that I I had a great composition teacher when I was in college. His name was Fred Coulter, and I, as far as jazz, I'm actually completely self-taught because I got a bachelor's and master's, bachelor's in classical piano, and then a master's in composition in piano, a double major. Um, but I learned jazz pretty much on my own, and some students that started at Kent State the same year that I went there, and starting in 1964, we actually started the first big band that they ever had. And but I was no my undergrad was in yeah, I guess it was a double major as undergrad, bachelor's in both classical piano and composition, and then my master's degree was just in composition. But anyway, this composition teacher, with all the undergraduate students, before we could write any personal music, we had to do a portfolio of studies in our first 2 years. So we had to write a fugue in the style of the Bach duets, and then a sonata allegro movement in the style of either Mozart or Haydn, and then a string quartet movement in the style of either the middle or late Beethoven quartets, and then a romantic song in the style of either Richard Strauss or Hugo Wolf. And then we had to do an impressionistic study. We could pick the composer to use as a model, and then a free tonal study in the style of composers like Hindemith or the Satie, or no, not Satie, Poulenc, um, Mio, yeah, the so-called neoclassical composers. And then we had to do a free 12-tone piece in the style of the no, not 12-tone, but atonal, but pre 12-tone in the using the language of any of the pre 12-tone music by Schoenberg, Berg, or Webern. And then we had to do a 12-tone piece and then a serial piece. And then after we wrote all that music, then we could write whatever we wanted. And he didn't really care if we wanted to write more tonal music or more experimental, but at least we really had absorbed the history of how the music evolved. So doing all of that analysis, it really helped me to hear how much the best jazz improvisers, when they played improvised solos, it wasn't just scales and arpeggios. It was actually taking particular motivic ideas and developing them in the same way that we do in compositions, only it was done spontaneously. Just like now we're having this conversation, instead of just reading an essay that I wrote, uh, I'm listening to questions that you have, or something that you want to discuss, and then I'm just using the language in a spontaneous way to respond to your question. That's very similar to what happens in music with improvisation. So um, a lot of the jazz solos that I'd either just learn from the records without writing them down, or the ones that I transcribed, I also would always go through from beginning to end and see both how different motivic ideas were developed through a section of the improvisation, but then I also would pay attention to all the places where the improvised lines were connected to the melody, where they might emphasize the same notes that happened in the melody, but maybe decorated them with enclosures, or maybe they just ended on the same final note as that phrase of the original melody. So that helped me a lot when I was writing these variations, because I I hadn't really absorbed uh, the language of all these styles in as disciplined a way as Dick Hyman. I mean, the thing that's amazing about Dick Hyman is he can he could take any tune from the American songbook that he knows, and he can play it for you his way. But then he can say, well, Bill Evans might have done this with the same tune, and then it sounds like Bill Evans. He really took it to kind of another level. But what helped me, and when I was writing these variations, was just even trying to compose variations that sounded like the particular player that I was trying to emulate, and also that used his way of developing motivic material in the section that's like the improvised solo. So yeah, I had actually written all those things before I met Hans and Veronica Gruber, and then at a certain point, when we were living in Germany in Cologne, when I was directing the WDR big band, Hans Gruber he uh, told me that he was interested in a project of having me record these variations, and but do them as a video. There's the studio in the Black Forest that's had a really great. It was a small, I think it was like a 6 foot, like the size of a Steinway B, but it was a Busendorfer, a small Busendorfer, really great piano, and we yeah, I can't remember his name now, but one of the guys, one of the engineers from ECM that had done a lot of the solo piano recordings, he he agreed to engineer this thing. So we recorded all the variations there, and they were videoed at the same time. And then I also did a little narrative about maybe a 1 minute or so on each of the pianists as far as their particular contribution in jazz history. So it's a kind of nice historical package. When it originally came out, we did it on VHS and beta tapes, but then they reissued it, I think, about maybe 10 or 15 years ago on a DVD. So you get the whole 24 variations on one thing.
Some of
So
it's on YouTube in Spanish, I think.
oh, I maybe somebody else overdubbed it in Spanish. The original one, my Spanish was not fluent enough, but I did the language, from a written text. My pronunciation was good enough that I did the text in English, German, and French.
Oh, that's good. And by the way, do you have the scores of these variations?
I don't, but I think they could. I think they could be ordered. There's a publisher. Originally, the publisher is Charles Colin, Colin, and his son is continuing that now. His son is Alan Colin, but they think the publisher is
Oh,
still called Charles Colin.
good to
Uh,
know.
I'm not sure if it's Charles Colin Publications, but you could probably Google that, and they published the 4 volumes of the contemporary jazz pianist, so they had the music for that too.
Oh, so
Um,
that's good to know.
yeah, one of my projects that I've tried to think of, that I hope to get to now that I'm retired, is I would like to. Originally, they just published the thing in my own manuscript. It was just like they photocopied my manuscripts of the things, and it was published that way. But I I have it in my mind, if I have time to do it, I'd like to take the scores and do the whole thing in finale, and maybe have some publisher uh, do a new edition.
Yeah, you know what? It's so good, so
Well,
good.
well, thank you. I'm glad you enjoyed it. I really really enjoyed it. I learned a lot from writing it, and I I think there's been maybe four periods where I did performances of that in person. I think the last time I played it at Eastman was about uh, it was I think it was about 15 years ago. It was while Harold Danko was still doing the jazz piano thing at Eastman. But yeah, I really enjoyed doing it, and it really helped me to become more fluent in all that vocabulary.
For sure. And my last question, Bill, what can you tell me about your relationship with Chicoria? You have transcribed Now He Sing, Now He Sobs, right? That
Yeah, yeah, and I also transcribed the first, well, most of the first volume of piano improvisations, the solo record for ECM. Yeah,
Yes, yes.
uh, yeah. Well, I got introduced to Chick Corea's music this way. Well, just before we moved to Eastman in 1973, from 71 to 73, right after I finished college, my wife Darlene and I we moved to Cleveland. It was not far from the Akron, Kent area where I grew up and went to school. And I was fortunate to get two continuous jazz jobs. So the whole time we were in Cleveland, I actually played jazz 7 nights a week and got paid for it. So it was amazing. There was a 6 night a week gig that was Monday through Saturday at this was a really nice restaurant near the old baseball stadium in downtown Cleveland. It's called the Theatrical Restaurant, and the leader of the trio was a drummer named Bob McKee. I think he was about at least 20 years older than I was, maybe 25 years older. There was a great bass player named Lamar Gaines. I think he's still around. Um, Black bass player really reminded me of just the sound and his walking lines and everything. It reminded me of Ron Carter. And but there had been an older piano player who had been the pianist in the trio, and at a certain time he decided to just play solo gigs because he could make a lot more money that way. And so they'd heard about me from a couple of mutual friends in Cleveland and offered me the job. So I was playing there Monday through Saturdays, and then that was kind of a conventional straight ahead kind of gig. On Sunday nights, there was this other jazz club in Cleveland called the Smiling Dog Saloon that was open 4 or 5 nights a week, including Sundays, and they had all of these. At the theatrical restaurant where I played, they had continuous music, so we were actually playing opposite some really great older jazz players. Like they had people like Jonah Jones and Cy Oliver and Teddy Wilson and um, Earl Hines and Clark Terry played there sometimes. Uh, so that was a real education, getting to hear those people and get to know them. And then at the Smiling Dog, they had all the modern groups like Chick Corea's Return to Forever band and the First Weather Report group with Wayne Shorter and Miroslav Vitus and uh, Eric Gravatt. And they had Herbie Hancock Sextet with Eddie Henderson and Julian Priester and Benny Maupin and
Wow.
Cannonball Adderley, Bill Evans Trio, Art Blakey, the Thad Jones, Mel Lewis Big Band. It was all these amazing groups. And there was a tenor player in town named Ernie Krivda, and we had a quintet that played at the Smiling Dog on Sunday nights. So we got to play opposite all these groups. Oh, Keith Jarrett's quartet was there too. Um, so um, anyway, well, I was there's a lot of interesting stuff in this story. When I was playing at the theatrical, there was a young lady that. I have to say this first. There was a guitarist in town that was older than me named Bob Fraser, and one night he used to come in to hear us at the theatrical restaurant, and we would hang out on the breaks and talk about music. So one night he came in and he said he actually brought me a copy of the recording. Now he sings, now he sobs. I'd never heard of Chick Corea, so he brought a copy of the record. And he said, "Bill, I just got this." He said, "You got to check this guy out, Chick Corea. He's really amazing. Um, you're going to love this." So as soon as I heard it, I knew I had to try to figure it all out. But in those days, the technology, this was before cassette cassette recorders and cassette players and CDs or any of that. That was just reel to reel tape recorders. So you had to, record a LP on a reel to reel tape and try to do it that way with headphones. So I just went at that, and within about a year, I think I transcribed everything Chick played on the whole record. And just this is how one thing can lead to another in a way too, because it was shortly after that the Return to Forever band played at the Smiling Dog. So I told Chick that I'd transcribed all this stuff, so he invited me to come by the hotel where they were staying. So I brought him. Uh, there weren't photocopies, but I got some of them. You had to actually copy them from photographic plates. I copied at least a few pages of the things for him, and then at least let him look through all the transcriptions that I'd done. We played through a couple of things, and he was really really impressed. He didn't think anybody could do that. So uh, when I got together with Hans and Veronica Gruber, Hans became a big fan of Chick Corea's music, and whenever Chick would play anywhere near Rodenburg, that was the little town near the Black Forest where the Grubers lived. Anytime he was playing in Germany or even in Austria nearby, Hans would go and hear him. And so he asked him if I had showed Hans these transcriptions. So he asked Chick if he would have any if you would have any objection to having these things published, and he was very interested in the idea. So when they finally came out with the transcription of that by Advanced Music, Hans had three hardbound copies made, and he kept one, and then he gave one to Chick, and then he had Chick sign one for me.
Oh, that's
So
good.
that was a kind of a nice, just that was sort of checking back after having met him in Cleveland. And once that book came out, well, we had each other's emails and all of that. So from that time on, I think about that was in the um, maybe the early '80s or so. Um, from then on, if Chick was ever playing in Rochester, he would always email me and let me know if you want tickets. Let me know. I'd love to see you backstage and everything. So that was
Oh, that's good, Bill. Oh,
yeah, yeah,
wow,
it was,
story.
yeah.
Oh, wow. Oh, Bill, thank you so much for this interview.
Well, you're welcome. Thank you for thinking of the idea of getting together, and maybe in a few months, sometime in the future, we'll do it again.
Oh, for sure. I miss enormously my period at Eastman. It was such a great time in my life,
Well,
uh,
we really enjoyed having you there.
both personally and as a musician. Was a life-changing experience to
Oh,
be
that's
there
great.
and to be your student.
Oh,
Thank you
that's
so
great.
much.
You're welcome. Well, I'll I'll go back over the music that you sent me, and we'll get together on the date that we discussed before. And I look forward to talking with you about that too. Okay?
Thank you so much. And once I have the chance to go to Rochester, we have to come back to that Chinese place.
Yeah.
We
Oh,
use it to have
I
lunch
don't.
there.
It's not there anymore.
Oh, really?
Yeah, because of COVID, they went out of business.
Ah,
But we'll find a place. If you come back to
we can
Rochester,
find a new
just
one.
just let me know, and we'll get together for dinner for sure.
Thank you so much, and my best regards to your family.
Okay, thanks, Marcelo. Bye
Bye bye,
bye.
Bill.